An archaeologist named Leslie Alcock decided to go after a legend. He packed his bag and drove towards the Somerset region located in the southern part of England. When he arrived in the area, amidst complex emotions, he entered a narrow dirt path and parked his car at the foot of the hill. Before him stood a hill, and on the hill there was a castle. The name of this hill is Cadbury Hill. Looking from the path, what he saw in front of him was not in a very understandable state. However, this hill was a hill that even became the subject of movies. Wild and tall grass extending from the top to the foothills, there were a few trees on its peak and slope. The local people used this place both for their animals and for agricultural purposes. And on the lips of the local people was a story, a legend beyond a story. They were saying that the castle located on the hill was Camelot. The name of that professor who came to research this whole legend is Leslie Alcock. He also served his country in India as a captain during World War II. And when he set out on this exploration, he was maintaining his professorship duty at the University of Glasgow. In a way, the fact that the name Arthur was so mythologized and fictionalized disturbed him, and he had set off towards reality. These types of events are a very risky move for archaeologists, because the process is long and difficult, and they have to dedicate all their valuable time to this work. We can give Klaus Schmidt as an example. He spent years researching Gerbichlite and passed away before reaching the conclusion of the research. Before starting the excavations on top of Cadbury Hill, a few journalists asked him what they were looking for here. He gave this answer to this question. He said that he was after a castle where a general, who gave the Saxons a hard time after the departure of Rome in the 5th and 6th centuries, maintained his existence. Following this answer, the journalist asked one more question. Do you really believe that King Arthur existed? Alcock's answer was clear. If such a king really existed, the evidence on this hill would tell us the truth. Because you can erase history, but you cannot destroy it. Then the first spade went into the ground, and what was found was truly something considerable. Right at this point, to understand the story arc, we must return to the beginning of the story, to the very beginning. Good evening and welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight we are stepping into one of the great blank spaces of our past. But before we go there, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. And before you drift off, I have a quick question for you. Do you think Camelot was a real, physical place, or just a beautiful story people invented to survive the Dark Ages? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy these quiet journeys. Please like and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders soften, and let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Now, to correctly understand the story, it is necessary to understand the period. That is why let's first look at what Britain looked like in the year 410. The year 410 is a year where there is real chaos. Almost 400 years of Roman dominance over Britain, exactly 400 years. The whole country had maintained their lives under Roman culture. Roads, cities, military units, law, all these were designed according to the Roman Empire. Even the names, even London's name was Londinium. Its importance was very great at those times too. Thousands of people are living, and it was like a common place of Western culture. They had their own unique baths. There were the York walls that everyone knew, and to be able to keep the Picts and the Scots away, there was the Hadrian Wall, which was 73 miles long across the north of the island, and whose name came from an emperor of Rome. At those times, the British people had adopted the Roman culture so much that the vast majority of the people saw themselves as Romans. Not even speaking their own languages, they were speaking Latin in their daily lives. This adoption was in such an advanced state that they were also worshipping Roman gods alongside their own gods. And the end had come. A letter came from the Roman Emperor Honorius, a short and concise letter. It was writing that Rome would no longer be able to protect the British lands and that they needed to fend for themselves. He had also added that no help would come due to the fact that the legions defending Britain, meaning the Roman military special unit, were needed in other places. So the Britons had to fend for themselves. The letter was explaining this. The campaign, first made to be able to take Britain, then the dominance during 400 years after it was taken, had ended not with great campaigns and unrest, but with a single letter. And this letter would actually bring the beginning of chaos. Hearing this news, all Saxons, regardless of young or old, started to flock to the eastern and southern coasts of Britain. However, this was not the only disaster the Picts had started to press from the north. Many British leaders and generals gathered and tried to choose a commander among themselves. They thought that a person needed to sit on the seat that Rome left behind. However, this one person lost every time, and someone else came in his place, and the one who came in his place was no different from the other. But one of them thought differently from the others, and made the decision that would affect the coming century. A figure named Vortigern invited the Saxons inside. To be more explanatory, the request of Vortigern from the Saxons was with them helping to face the Picts coming from the north. The Saxons would help the British and stop the Picts. If they could stop them, they would own a land in the south of Britain. There were two brothers named Hengist and Horsa, whom Vortigern invited to England, and who were known as the two heads of the Saxons. These two brothers had looked warmly upon this idea, and they were brothers who generally thought the same things in their ideas. What Vortigern wanted had happened. With these two brothers coming to England, they sent word to their hometowns, and more forces from the Saxons came, then again and again. The adversary of yesterday had become a friend today. However, how true was this? Taking courage from their communities, the Saxons took a front against Vortigern and started to take the land located in the south without consent, not by agreement. So this gamble that Vortigern played would greatly harm him, not only him, but his country greatly. Around the years 540, a monk who penned the old history of Britain, and who was a Briton, had written about this event, that Vortigern made one of the biggest mistakes in British history. Gildas was not someone who spared his words. He had defined the Saxons, meaning the Saxons who would bring the adversary into the country and bring them up to the level of collapse, by saying a fierce, unruly group. After this writing, there is another interesting writing of Gildas. He has also written for the Saxons advancing like a huge fireball, that they suddenly slowed down. He has called this part a period of recovery for Britain. Well, why had this fireball stopped? When the Saxons were going to control all of Britain, why hadn't they done this? In the times of the 5th century, the Saxon advance had seriously stopped. However, this stop was not for a few years, but they had slowed themselves down for a whole generation. The Saxons advancing towards the west and north in a chain of command stopped this advance and de facto retreated. Gildas has written in his writings that the reason for the stopping of the Saxons was related to a standoff. The name of this standoff is called the Standoff of Mons Badonicus. Gildas has mentioned about this standoff as a definitive England victory. This standoff is so important that it is a standoff at a level to stop the Saxon danger for a generation, and he has written that this campaign was between the year 490 and the year 516. He has added that this is the biggest victory that the Britons won against the Saxons throughout his own life. However, we are coming to the part where the storyline begins. Gildas has not written who won this campaign. There is no commander's name. He has not written anything explaining, describing that commander, or any feature regarding the commander. He is just explaining the victory and passing on. Here, this writing is the beginning of an event that is one of the biggest mysteries of British history. Well, why hadn't he written it? This writer, who fears no one, who criticizes 5 emperors in his period, and states that he is ashamed of them, why hadn't this writer, this historian, mentioned this commander? We know nothing regarding the commander himself who won such a great victory, and what is bad is no one knows anything. However, exactly 300 years after the 500s, meaning around the year 820, a historian, writes a writing about this subject. And the name of this historian is Nennius. In his writings, Nennius gives this great commander the name Arthur. He defines Arthur not as a king, but as the leader of the forces. And he gives the 12 campaigns that Arthur won against the Saxons in a listed way. There doesn't seem to be any mistake on the list. The things he writes are not only about campaigns, but he also defines geography. He also adds rivers, hills, and regions into his notes. At the end of this 12 campaign list, meaning to the name of the last campaign, he adds his notes saying Mons Badonicus. According to what Nennius wrote, he has also written that Arthur and the forces in his unit overcame 960 Saxon units in a single advance. Yes, you didn't hear it wrong, exactly 960 men in one advance. Of course, at this point, it is necessary not to forget this. This thing he tells is a narrative that became a legend from language to language. No commander can overcome 960 men at a single advance. It is thought that it was exaggerated verbally among the public. The thing that Nicholas Hayem, a professor at Manchester University, put forward in his dated English conquest book, published in 1994, in his book named Guildes and Britain in the 5th Century, is this. According to Hayem's thought, this oral narrative was organized by making additions from generation to generation, and the original text was definitely not adhered to. Hayem states the reason for these additions is that due to the pressure coming from the Welsh Saxons and Vikings in the 9th century, and the hardships they caused a hero, an idol was needed for the British people. He says that for this reason, a commander who was never defeated who stopped a whole force was added. So he says the event here is that they created a figure that came out of themselves as against these advances. He says this figure is a need of the resilience. Hayem expresses this situation clearly in a BBC interview in 2004. In this interview, he says he made this inference due to the fact that there is no information regarding Arthur in their own sources or in adversary sources. Separately, he thinks that the fact that Gildas and Bede also do not mention him says that such a figure does not exist. However, Hayem opens a parenthesis here: the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. However, not every historian thinks like Hayem. John Morris, who is an instructor at University College London, defends the opposite of Hayem's ideas in his book named Age of Arthur that he published in 1973. Here it is impossible not to give John credit. Because what was the thing that stopped a group like the Saxons, even according to Gildas, an encroaching group for a generation? John's view also believed that someone, king or leader, whatever, stopped the Saxons. According to Morris, the name of this leader was not certain, so for him he did not mention this figure with a name like King Arthur either. However, he also believed that a man did all of these. Right in this part, he presented an interesting but a highly logical evidence. Towards the end of the 5th century, he started to hear the name Arthur within many dynasty members in Wales, in Ireland, in Scotland, and among the kingdoms of these regions. While this name had not passed in any source before, how did it happen that this name suddenly entered the geography at the end of the 500s? As it is in our present day, there was a tradition in the past too. People used to give the names of heroes to their children. In my opinion too, it is a bit interesting that different kingdoms and many families in different regions gave this name to their children. As an example to this, we can also give the name Riothamus. I mean, Riothamus is not a name, actually it is a title. It means the supreme king in the Britannic language of Britain. This name comes from a historical figure whose reality has been proven, and it also takes place in the continental sources of the period. A Roman poet named Sidonius writes a letter to this king between the 460s and 470s. This letter has reached to our present day, and he writes this letter addressed to Riothamus, who is the king of Britain. What Riothamus did is striking in its parallels to the Arthur legend. He crossed from Britain to Gaul with a force. He stood alongside Roman allies against the Visigoths. He was betrayed by a Roman official named Arvandus. He was overcome in confrontation near Burgundy around 470 AD, and then he disappeared. He withdrew eastward toward a place called Avalon, a real town in the Burgundy region of modern France, and he was never heard from again. The historian Geoffrey Ashe, writing in his 1985 book The Discovery of King Arthur, was the first to argue systematically that Riothamus was the historical original behind the Arthur legend. Avalon and Avalon are the same word. Riothamus crossed the sea to stand on foreign soil, as Arthur does. Riothamus was betrayed by a trusted associate, as Arthur is. Riothamus vanished after his final confrontation without a confirmed passing, as Arthur does. The case is not universally accepted. Hayam and others argue the parallels are interesting but not conclusive. But the parallel has never been dismissed entirely either. And the honest answer is that the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain are so poorly documented that a figure like Arthur could have existed and left almost no trace in the surviving record. The documentary evidence from this period is extraordinarily thin. We know the names of almost none of the British leaders who faced the Saxons. What we know for certain is this: the Saxons advanced, and then they stopped. For a generation they stopped, and then they advanced again. Something stopped them, we do not know what, and into that gap, that documented pause in the Saxon expansion of Britain, someone placed a name: Arthur. And the name fit so well and served so many purposes for so many different people across so many centuries that it never came out again. In 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published a book that changed everything. The book was called Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, and it told the story of Britain from its supposed founding by a Trojan refugee named Brutus all the way through to the Saxon expansions of the 7th century. It was written in Latin, the common language of educated Europe. And it was filled with campaigns and prophecies and kings and sorcerers and love affairs and deceptions. And in the middle of it, stretching across several long chapters, was the story of Arthur. Geoffrey's Arthur was not the fragmentary figure of Nennius's campaign list or the unnamed victor of Gildas's account. Geoffrey's Arthur was a fully realized king. He had a court. He had a queen named Guinevere. He had a magician named Merlin who engineered his conception and guided his early life. He had a sword of extraordinary power. He expanded his rule across not just Britain but France and Norway and Denmark and Iceland, and was on the verge of expanding his rule into Rome itself when he was called back to Britain by the deception of his nephew Mordred. He faced his final confrontation at a place called Camelot. He was critically weakened, and he was carried away to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his condition, with the promise that he would return when Britain needed him most, the once and future king. Camelot is not in Geoffrey's book by that name. The name Camelot was added by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes a few decades later, but the idea of Camelot, the great court, the gathering place of the finest knights, the center of a just and powerful kingdom, all of that is in Geoffrey, and the book spread like nothing before it. Within 2 years of publication, Henry of Huntingdon, one of the most respected historians in England, encountered a copy of the Historia at a monastery in Normandy and wrote an astonished letter to a colleague. He had never seen anything like it. A complete history of Britain going back to Troy, full of kings and campaigns he had never heard of. He was both impressed and suspicious. That suspicion was shared by other contemporaries. William of Newburgh, writing later in the 12th century, was one of the most direct. He called Geoffrey's work a mass of fictions invented to gratify the Britons. He said that Geoffrey had used the cloak of the Latin language to dress up nonsense in the garb of history. William of Newburgh was right, but nobody listened to him, because the book was too good, too detailed, too satisfying. It gave the people of Britain a past they could be proud of. It gave them a golden age. It gave them a king who had made their island the center of the known world. At least for a while. Today we have 215 surviving manuscript copies of the Historia Regum Britanniae. For comparison, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, one of the most important works of early medieval scholarship, survives in around 160 copies. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales survives in 83. Geoffrey's Arthur story reached more people in the Middle Ages than either of them. Geoffrey had claimed in his preface that the entire history was translated from a very old book in the British language, brought to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. This old book has never been found. It is almost certainly a fiction. Helen Fulton, professor of medieval literature at the University of Bristol, writing in a 2009 essay in a companion to Arthurian literature, described the source claim as almost universally rejected by modern scholars. She said Geoffrey was almost certainly composing freely from a combination of genuine Welsh traditions, classical sources, and his own imagination. But the invention of the source was clever. It gave the book an authority it would not otherwise have had. It implied antiquity. It implied authenticity. It allowed Geoffrey to present his inventions as discoveries rather than creations, and the timing of those inventions was not accidental. In 1066, the Normans had taken control of England. By 1136, they had been ruling Britain for 70 years. And the relationship between the Norman ruling class and the native British population was still tense. The Normans were outsiders. They spoke a different language. They had taken the land without consent. Arthur was useful to them, because Arthur was British, not Norman. But the kind of Britain Arthur ruled in Geoffrey's telling was organized along lines that would have been immediately recognizable to a 12th century Norman lord. A powerful centralized court. A system of knightly service and obligation. A king who dispensed justice and commanded loyalty. Arthur's world looked, in other words, very much like a Norman kingdom. John Gillingham, emeritus professor of medieval history at the London School of Economics, argued in several essays published in the 1990s that Geoffrey's Arthur served a specific political function. He gave the Norman kings of England a prestigious British predecessor. To rule a kingdom that had once been ruled by Arthur was itself a kind of endorsement. King Edward I understood this perfectly. In 1278, Edward travelled to Glastonbury Abbey and presided over the ceremonial reburial of what the monks claimed were the forms of Arthur and Guinevere. Edward was at that moment engaged in military campaigns to bring Wales and Scotland under control, and he wanted to make a point. Arthur was gone and laid to rest. There would be no return. The once and future king's future had arrived, and it was wearing a Norman crown. It was a piece of political theatre, but it required something to perform against, and that something had been provided 87 years earlier, in 1191, by the monks of Glastonbury themselves. In 1184, Glastonbury Abbey burned. The fire ruined most of the monastic complex, including the old church, which was said to be one of the holiest sites in Britain. The abbey needed money for reconstruction, large amounts of money. And in 1191, during a period of fundraising that the abbey desperately needed to succeed, the monks announced that they had discovered, during excavations in the abbey grounds, the resting place of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The resting place was a hollowed oak log placed 16 feet underground. Inside were forms described as of great size, consistent with a powerful man, and fixed to the underside of a stone slab above the resting place was a leaden cross with an inscription in Latin. Here rests the famous King Arthur with Guinevere, his second wife, in the Isle of Avalon. The discovery was reported by Gerald of Wales, who visited Glastonbury shortly after the announcement and described the cross and the forms in detail. Gerald was an educated man and not generally credulous. He accepted the discovery as genuine. Most modern historians do not. Christopher Snyder, professor of history at Marymount University and author of The World of King Arthur, published in 2000, described the Glastonbury discovery as almost certainly a fabrication. The timing is too convenient. Snyder wrote, a major fire, a need for reconstruction funds, and then a miraculous discovery that would bring pilgrims from across Europe. The cross itself, which survived until the 17th century when it was lost, showed letter forms inconsistent with the date the monks claimed for it. The forms are gone. The cross is gone. The resting place marker is still there in the grass of Glastonbury Abbey. Tourists visit it every day. Arthur is not there. But what Geoffrey of Monmouth started could not be stopped by a fraudulent resting place or a skeptical historian. The French took the story and kept building. Crescent de Troyes, writing in the 1170s and 1180s, introduced Lancelot, the greatest of Arthur's knights, and the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere that would eventually collapse Camelot. He introduced the Grail, the sacred vessel that the Knights of the Round Table spent years searching for. He gave Arthur's court the name Camelot. He developed the Round Table as a symbol of equality, so that no one sat at the head and no one sat below. Wolfram von Eschenbach in Germany added the full Grail mythology. The anonymous French Vulgate cycle of the 13th century wove everything together into a vast, interconnected narrative. And then in 1485, Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur was published by William Caxton, making it one of the first books printed in England. Malory's Arthur is the version most people know. The Sword in the Stone, Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake, the Fellowship of the Round Table, the Quest for the Holy Grail, the Deception of Mordred, the Final Confrontation, the Barge to Avalon, and the epitaph that has stayed with the legend ever since. Hic iacit Arthurus, rex quandam rix futurus. Here rests Arthur, the once and future king, a man who never passed away, who only sleeps, who will return when Britain has need of him. Geoffrey of Monmouth passed away in 1155. He never said whether Arthur was real. He probably did not know himself, but what he built has lasted 900 years and is still being built. And the question of whether there was a real man underneath all of it has never gone away, which is where the archaeologists came in. Leslie Alcock did not go to Cadbury Castle alone. He went with the Camelot Research Committee, which was a group of professional archaeologists assembled specifically for this excavation, and the committee included some of the biggest names in British archaeology at the time. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who had excavated sites across India and Britain and was one of the most famous archaeologists in the world, lent his name to the project. Rayleigh Radford, who had spent decades working on early medieval and Dark Age sites, provided expertise. The committee raised money, organized logistics, and gave the project the institutional credibility it needed, and then they dug. The first season in 1966 was preliminary. Test trenches, soil sampling, survey work. But even in that first season, the results were suggestive. The ceramics coming out of the ground included fragments of imported Mediterranean pottery dating to the late 5th and early 6th centuries. This type of pottery, known among archaeologists as Tintagel ware or class, and Class B amphorae, was found at only a small number of sites in post-Roman Britain, and those sites tended to be places of wealth and importance. Somebody at Cadbury Castle in 500 had been rich enough to import goods from the Mediterranean world. In a period when most of Britain had reverted to subsistence-level existence, that was significant. The main excavation seasons ran from 1967 to 1970, and what they found exceeded almost everyone's expectations. Beneath the later medieval and Iron Age deposits, Alcock's team uncovered evidence of a massive post-Roman refurbishment of the hilltop fortifications. The ramparts of Cadbury Castle, which had originally been built during the Iron Age, had been rebuilt and strengthened sometime around 470 to 500 AD. The new fortifications included a timber-framed wall approximately 1,100 meters in circumference, which is roughly 3/4 of a mile. This wall would have required an enormous amount of timber and an enormous amount of organized labor to construct. Inside the refurbished fortifications, the team found evidence of a large timber hole. The hole measured approximately 20 meters by 10 meters, making it one of the largest post-Roman structures identified anywhere in Britain at that time. Its size and position at the highest point of the hilltop within the fortified perimeter strongly suggested it was a chieftain's hall, the kind of building where a powerful leader would have held court, received tribute, fed his forces, and conducted the business of ruling. Alcock was careful about what he claimed. In his 1972 book on the excavation, published by his Excavation in Camelot, which became a bestseller by archaeological standards, Alcock wrote that the evidence pointed to a major refortification of the site during the period when a historical Arthur would have lived, if Arthur existed. He described Cadbury as a place of high status and strategic function in the post-Roman period. He did not say he had found Camelot. He said he had found the kind of place that stories about a place like Camelot might have been attached to. That distinction matters, but the newspapers predictably did not make it. The coverage of the Cadbury excavation in the British press was extensive and enthusiastic. The Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian all ran stories, and most of those stories used the word Camelot without qualification. Alcock spent years afterward carefully correcting the record in academic publications, while watching the popular press continue to describe Cadbury Castle as the site of Camelot. The relationship between archaeological evidence and popular belief is not always a comfortable one, but Cadbury was not the only site producing interesting results. Tintagel Castle on the North Cornish coast had long been associated with the Arthurian legend. Geoffrey of Monmouth had placed Arthur's conception there. The castle itself was built in the 12th century, well after the period when a historical Arthur would have lived, but the headland it sat on had clearly been occupied much earlier. In 1998, during routine work on the site by English Heritage, a worker named Kevin Giddens was clearing debris from a drainage channel when he noticed marks on a piece of slate that had been reused as a drain cover. The marks were writing. The piece of slate, which became known as the Artognou stone, was dated to the 6th century by the style of the lettering, and among the inscriptions on the stone was a name. The name was Artognou, pronounced Artognou, and it appeared in a Latin inscription that roughly translates as Artognou, descendant of Patern, made this. Artognou is not Arthur. The name means something like bare knowledge and comes from the same Celtic root as the name Arthur, which may come from the Celtic word for bare, art, or alternatively from the Latin artorius. They are related but not identical, but the discovery generated enormous press coverage. The local tourism officer for Cornwall told reporters that the stone proved Arthur was real and that Tintagel was his birthplace. English Heritage, the organization responsible for the site, was considerably more cautious. The chief executive at the time issued a statement saying that the stone was a remarkable and genuine 6th century inscription, but that it provided no evidence for the historical existence of King Arthur. Charles Thomas, Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at the University of Exeter, and one of the foremost authorities on post-Roman Cornwall, told The Guardian in a 1998 interview that the stone was genuinely exciting as evidence of literacy and Latin culture at Tintagel in the 6th century, but that connecting it to the Arthurian legend required a leap of faith he was not willing to make. A rock with a similar-sounding name, he said, is not a biography. And then there is the broader question that Alcock's excavation raised and never fully answered. Cadbury Castle is impressive. The evidence of a major post-Roman refurbishment is real. The timber hall is real. The Mediterranean pottery is real. And the site's location in Somerset, roughly in the center of the region where a Dark Age British leader would have needed to operate to coordinate resilience against the Saxons advancing from the east and south, is geographically plausible for a strategic headquarters. But Cadbury is not the only site with this kind of evidence. South Cadbury in Somerset is one of perhaps half a dozen post-Roman hill forts in southern Britain that show evidence of major activity in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Tintagel itself shows evidence of substantial high-status occupation in this period. Wroxeter in Shropshire, which was one of the largest Roman cities in Britain, shows evidence of continued occupation and even new building activity in the 5th century, when most Roman towns were being abandoned. The Dark Age landscape of Britain was more complex and more active than the popular image of a collapsed civilization suggests. And what that complexity means for the Arthur question is this: if there was a real Arthur, he was almost certainly one of several powerful leaders operating in post-Roman Britain in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. He was not the only one. He may not even have been the most important one, but he may have been the one whose story, for reasons of geography or personality or strategic success or simple narrative luck, got attached to the oral tradition that eventually became the legend. And that oral tradition was then collected, amplified, and transformed by Nennius in the 9th century and Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th into something so much larger than any real person that the real person, if he existed, became impossible to see. Nicholas Hayam and Geoffrey Ashe, the two scholars who have argued most publicly on opposite sides of the question of a historical Arthur, were both asked in separate interviews conducted by BBC History magazine to summarize their positions. Hayam said, "The burden of proof lies with those who claim Arthur existed. That proof has not been produced. The silence of contemporary sources is deafening." Ashe said, "The absence of proof is not the same as disproof. We have indirect evidence that is consistent with a real figure. The traditions are too widespread and too old to have been invented from nothing. Neither of them is entirely wrong." And Leslie Alcock, the man who dug Cadbury Castle and spent the rest of his career thinking about what he found there, published a paper in 1995, 25 years after the excavation ended, in which he reflected on what the Cadbury evidence did and did not show. He wrote that the site demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that Cadbury Castle was a place of major strategic and political significance in the period when Arthur is supposed to have lived. He wrote that the evidence was consistent with the site being associated with a powerful leader of the kind that the Arthur legends describe. And then he wrote something that has stayed with researchers ever since. He wrote that archaeology can tell us what happened, and sometimes where and sometimes when, but it cannot tell us the name of the man who ordered the walls built or sat in the Great Hall or led the force that went out through the gate. That name, he wrote, we will probably never recover. It may have been Arthur. It may not have been, but someone was there. So that is the story of King Arthur. A silence in the historical record that a name filled. Gildas wrote about the confrontation that stopped the Saxons and did not say who won it. And into that silence over the next 3 centuries, a figure grew. A dux bellorum, a leader of campaigns. A man who had once held the line when everything was falling apart. And then in 1136, Geoffrey of Monmouth sat down and built a palace around that figure. Gave him a queen and a magician and a sword and a round table, and a court where the greatest knights in the world gathered and justice was done and the kingdom was strong. And the monks of Glastonbury gave him a resting place, and Crescent de Troyes gave him Camelot, and Thomas Malory gave him an ending. Hic iacit Arthurus rex quandam rex futurus. Here rests Arthur, the once and future king. Leslie Alcock passed away in 2006. He had spent 40 years thinking about Cadbury Castle and what he found there and what it meant. In his last published interview given to the journal Britannia in 2004, he was asked one final time whether he believed King Arthur had existed. He paused for a long time, and then he said, "I believe someone existed. I believe that Cadbury Castle was his or someone very like him. I believe the silence in the sources is not the silence of absence, but the silence of a world that was too busy surviving to keep records." And then he said, "Whether his name was Arthur, I cannot tell you, but I can tell you this. Whoever he was, he deserved the legend. And it is late now. The questions will still be there in the morning. The scholars will still be arguing. The tourists will still be visiting Glastonbury and looking at the marker in the grass and thinking about a king who may or may not have lived 1500 years ago. And Cadbury Castle will still be there in Somerset, a grassy hill with sheep on the slopes, the walls of the great post-Roman fortification buried a few feet below the surface, the place where someone once built something large and strong and meant to last. It lasted. We just do not know whose name to put on it. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop. The once and future king is still out there somewhere, sleeping in the hill, waiting for Britain to need him again. And that is enough for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History for Sleep. And if you did, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button and leave a comment below telling us whether you think King Arthur was real. And I read every comment and I will be happy to respond. And if you know someone who likes falling asleep to forgotten history, please share this with them. And if you would like more stories like this one, all you need to do is subscribe to History for Sleep. Good night.